First thing, by the way, when we do religious liberty weekends, I love it. And we could actually call it a character of God weekend. What you said about the gospel is central to everything, right? And how is religious liberty connected with the character of God? Before we even talk about Project 2025, it's the most important truth in the universe ever, is who God is and what his methods are in dealing with the rebellion that arose. So in a universe of freedom and God's love being the law of life for the universe, that is why we have conversations about religious liberty. It's not so much defending my rights and this sort of thing, but compassion and empathy for the marginalized, the persecuted, and then a witness to the most important truth in the universe. That's who God is. And so Project 2025 is obviously one of the most controversial things in our society today. And the media, the mainstream media have their political perspective on it and have a whole lot to say about it being, it's abortion stance, LGBT, immigration, climate, basically all the what you'd expect, left versus right, public policy wars. So they're kind of angry, the mainstream media, with their perspective on that. One thing, and that really hasn't been much of our discussion as the people of God. The piece that we've been discussing more has been on page 589, which we can discuss. But kind of the big picture on Project 2025 is that it's been said that it's going to be establishing a dictatorship and removing a branch of government and some somewhat hyperbolic types of phrases and statements that have been made about Project 2025. So right out of the gates is important, I think, that we maintain accuracy, credibility in the way that we talk about these things. I just read a Time magazine piece just this week that was pretty typical of that sort of approach, where it referred to it as going to be an expansion of the imperial presidency. That's a term that dates back to LBJ and Nixon period, and so that would be nothing new. But then I read the article looking for exactly how would Project 2025 be expanding the size and scope and power of the executive branch of the federal government? And there weren't any examples given. There are some examples when you read the document. I haven't read all 900 pages, but I've seen that it would devolve education policy down to the state and local areas. So that would be a rescinding, a rolling back of federal executive power. It would be deregulating on some environmental and climate policies. So that would again be a rescinding of federal executive power. There would be an extension of power on immigration policy, enforcement of that being more strict. But kind of the hyperbolic statements, it's a dictatorship and this sort of thing, we want to be careful with. And some of our own people, we can get sucked into exaggeratory statements that we're just taking our cues from a certain ideological wing of mainstream media, repeating that, and then it's not actually in there. So what is actually kind of shocking about this whole discussion with Project 2025 is not so much the policy prescriptions, but the fact that the bureaucracy itself over the last 100 years got as big and powerful as it did. And so this is kind of a nerdy constitutional political science conversation, but the idea that the incoming administration would populate the civil service positions that are policy indicative types of positions with people of their ideological persuasion is not that surprising, really. Maybe it's surprising that it hasn't happened till now, but I remembered hearing it's a purge, and like it's Soviet Russia kind of using rhetoric again in that regard. But the civil service, non-military, non-immigration bureaucracy is populated with about 80% from the Democratic persuasion. So the Republicans of Project 2025 are like, hey, if we get power, we're going to put our people in, apply our policies through the bureaucracy. But then again, you get the hyperbole of it's shutting down a branch of government. But remember from our Constitution, there are 3 branches of government. There's a proverbial 4th branch of government, the bureaucracy, but that's within the executive branch. So there's legislative, executive, and judicial, and all of the agencies and departments that are being discussed with Project 2025 about putting your people in to apply your policies. From their mindset, it's like, this is democratic because we've been elected with the executive branch, so we should apply the policies that the voters elected for. I don't actually personally like the Project 2025 blueprint, but we want to make sure we are accurate about it. If you were going with a true, constitutional perspective on it, you'd be like, 2025, abolish this department, end that agency. And because when you go to Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, there's very limited and defined powers that the federal government is permitted to exert. So that's kind of the big picture. There's some more religious liberty related things that should be discussed, but I don't want to monopolize. Oh, there is when they say federal funding for abortion, taxpayers may have a free exercise religious conviction about taxpayer dollars going to fund abortion. So that would be one thing that would actually be a favorable to religious liberty position taken in Project 2025.
So I just want to reiterate here that if you find a group of people to talk faster, this would be very hard pressed. I'd like you to introduce them. The packed density of information you're going to get within 40 minutes is going to be astounding to you. So that being said, Scott, thank you so much. Totalitarian type of government. These things don't happen rapidly. And a lot of the times it takes a fair amount of time doing this. What have you found out in your researching and the things that you come across? First of all, how does 2025 offer the ability to do totalitarian type activities? And second, how do you actually get someone to go into it? Because if you ask right now, anyone, even on the street, say hey, you know what? We have this opportunity right now that I can legislate something so that you'll never do that again. No one's going to really sign up for that and say, well, no, I don't want it, no. They're not going to want to do that. But at some point, as we read in Revelation chapter 13, they're going to welcome it. So what have you seen that can start driving us in that direction?
What you're talking about is the frog in the pot.
Yeah.
We're going to get there incrementally. We don't jump to Revelation 13 fulfillment of no buy, no sell, and death decree overnight. So you get a toe in the door, you move slowly. The beast's mark will be enforced. There will be national laws on these things. And there have been national laws in other nations for 100 years. A little history on Project 2025's page 589, the notorious page from our perspective, but little history on it is, broadly speaking, in the Western world, during the labor reforms of the progressive era, organized labor advocated for a policy where on Sundays, employees would need to be paid time and a half. So the employer was required to pay employees time and a half if he was asking them to work on Sundays. And so that was a common practice during the progressive era, progressive labor union type of policy. It did not come to America on a national level. We don't have a national Sunday law. We've had blue laws in the States. But what Project 2025 on page 589 of their 900 pages is proposing is to bring that progressive policy to America, and then they couch it in sort of religious terms of community observance of a day. I've actually got the words. They call for legal regulation of work on what they call the Sabbath, and looking for a communal day of rest. So that kind of language gets the attention of prophecy students. Not that it's the final Sunday law, but it would be a national Sunday law if this proposal was to be drafted as legislation and passed. And so the specific proposal is Congress should encourage communal rest by, and then they say, requiring employers to pay their employees time and a half for work done on Sunday. They make allowance for an employer who is a Sabbath keeper of, for example, the seventh day. If he's got his employees working on Sunday, he doesn't have to pay time and a half. But when you zoom out and look at the population and how people are functioning on a practical level with regard to their rest observances, about 85% of the country doesn't really have a refrain from secular labor day. A lot of people attend church on Sunday, but only about 15% of the country refrains from labor, secular labor, on a day. Majority of those being Sunday. About 2% or less are seventh-day Sabbath keepers. So the 85% that don't observe a rest day would be, by this policy, pressured. The employer would essentially be paying a fine, if you will, but it goes to the employee. It's inducing the employer to close on Sunday. And I've read about inducements that come in prior to the final Sunday legislation. So it's not nothing, but it's also not, light your hair on fire, this is it. But this is the beginning of it, because this would be the first national Sunday law of its kind. Again, speaking accurately and temperately without, sweeping statements that aren't based in the actual language of the text is important. But I think seeing it for what it is, saying we want to have a communal day of rest, this is kind of that take America back for God concept that you've heard, which we believe in doing. Like, wait, what did you just say, Scott? Take America back for God? Yes, we believe in doing it through God's methods. Not through legislation, not through compelling employers through that sort of policy that would penalize them for being open on. And we actually want to bring people to observance of the true biblical Sabbath day. And we don't do that by proposing policies that we want the federal government to pass a law making employers pay their employees time and a half for being open on Saturday. That would not be God's methods of how to deal with soul winning. We want to persuade, come now let us reason together, love, serve, and just reflect God's character. So the Christian mindset that would approach it this way, whether you call it a progressive policy or whether you call it the religious right, is pretty irrelevant because the methods are not of God. And we can say emphatically from our religious liberty standpoint, we would not favor page 589 of Project 2025.
And so I got a follow-up for you real quick. That was very well put. Is this kind of like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in Babylon, where they're basically going up to this image and they can see it every day being built, and they know it. So it's taking time, but they know what's coming because they know what the actual prophecy was. But every single day they made up their mind that they were not going to do this. In other words, as Daniel said in Daniel chapter 1, they purposed in their hearts that they would not defile themselves. And in this case here, is this kind of like the same thing? This might be the introduction into the, let's just say, the breaking of the First Amendment, the first part of it, the Establishment Clause.
Yes, absolutely. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, nor prohibit the free exercise thereof. So there's the two clauses in the religious freedom component of the First Amendment, the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause. Free exercise means you can exercise your religion freely. We don't do church lockdowns, closures of churches during the signs of the times, which we should expect. And even more, as the day approaches, we need to assemble ourselves together prudently, safely, but following that counsel. So there have been a lot of things that have infringed on the free exercise of religion. We could go on and on and on about that. But what you just brought up is the Establishment Clause. To call Sunday in federal legislation, if this policy was to be drafted as legislation, to call Sunday the Sabbath and say that we're gonna try to have a communal day of rest, this would be edging into establishing a religious doctrine. And most Americans don't actually believe in legislating Christian beliefs from the federal government, but it is something. It's not nothing. What you said is the statue. I find that interesting because you're going to build that statue from the toes up, right? And literally the phrase that I had in my mind about page 589 was, it's a Sunday law toe in the door. So maybe it's the building of that statue, and we're seeing it constructed before our very eyes.
So you mentioned the Establishment Clause, but then you also mentioned, what was it called again?
The Free Exercise Clause.
Okay, so the Free Exercise Clause. How this actually happens within the media.
Yeah, I'll just use Edward Bernays' own words. He was the founder of a lot of that manipulation in the 1920s. I can't tell you his whole story, but he said, we are governed, our minds molded, our tastes formed, our ideas suggested, largely by men we have never heard of. He called them the invisible government of the mind, and he said that they are the ones that pull the wires that control the public mind, and that we will be able to control the group mind without them even knowing about it. So there's a lot more as far as them admitting what they are doing over the last century. I won't do the Media on the Brain seminar right now. Just email me. I'll send you links. Just email me, scottritsema@gmail.com, and I'll send you some links to watch on that. And I also, when we were here in January, did a little bit of a segment on media's effect on social control and the schooling, too. So I can send you a link to that, to the Religious Liberty event that was here in January. So just email me, scottritsema@gmail.com. And I love, John, how you're doing the dichotomy here between the 2025, which is like enforcement, or not enforcement yet, but edging into that Sunday enforcement, and the 2030, which you would call the secular agenda, which Chris aptly pointed out that actually it's polytheistic, paganistic, earth worship. But, what we need to make sure of is that we don't become yoked to a political party or ideology.
Absolutely.
Because if you do, then you're trying to speak to religious liberty, but 9/11 happens and you're drawn over here and you're part of the group that's like, yeah, make all Muslims carry, unique identification bearing their faith. And, let's persecute people because of their religious faith. Or COVID happens and you're like, let's persecute the unvaccinated because I'm in this party or I was in this party. And if it is how we vote is between the individual and God, and as a people, we look at the kingdom of God. We have a better country and heavenly, and the principles of that kingdom should inform all of our public policy, religious liberty, voting, and conversation habits when it comes to these things. Because, we often speak of the religious right, and if our religious liberty departments become so myopically focused only on that danger, then what happens is, it wasn't the religious right that did the mandates, that shut down the churches, we've got a genocide over the past 50 years of millions of babies. It wasn't the religious right. So we got to see both is what I think the idea here is across to kind of sum up a lot of what's been discussed. And we got to make sure our own church voice on this maintains objectivity so we don't get what we just had over the last 3 years.